Hello and welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Tim Smith and our guest today is Dr. Xiaoyun Yu. Dr. Yu is the Arthur M. Weimer Faculty Fellow at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Her research interests are in the areas of theoretical and empirical corporate finance, and her current research focuses are on information economics, security design, initial public offering, financial institutions and systems, and political economy of finance. Dr. Yu recently co-authored a paper in the Externalities of Corruption, Evidence from Entrepreneurial Activity in China. Today, Dr. Yu will share her insights on the state of entrepreneurship in China and how corruption may be influencing the ability of small and young firms to compete. Dr. Yu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To begin with, can you describe the current state of entrepreneurship in China? Is this something that the current business ecosystem in China encourages?
That's actually a very good question, Tim. It's also a very big question. So I've been thinking there are lots of vibrant entrepreneurial activities in China, lots of new ideas, lots of new technologies, lots of innovations. They're actually, in terms of ecosystem, right now I can think about maybe 4 elements. And number one definitely is human capital. There are lots of now skilled labor, people educated domestically, people get educations overseas, going back, and these people actually bring in more and more the growth in the economy by pushing their own entrepreneur firms and developing their own technologies. Another element that I think is very important is actually the government involvement. So there's a very big role by government in terms of policies, in terms of regulations, and these kind of activities actually in some way actually help entrepreneurial activities. For example, you think about this One Belt, One Road policy, basically go to reshape the regional interactions among countries, and that provides lots of opportunities for local entrepreneurs. The third one I can think about is that regardless, when people think about the current financial system, they are getting better and better. So the financial system, the way to get external financing, getting more and more developed, and there are more and more people getting the way to finance their growth. So that's what I would say would be the several very important elements that contribute to this current ecosystem.
Great. Would the word transparency come up at all when you think of the current ecosystem?
Definitely. Believe it or not, actually starting 2007, there's a big change in China's accounting system. And actually the government actually required literally similar disclosure policies as we see in the West world. But the issue, is always about you have all these laws and policies and requirements, but what exactly the consequences of implementation? And that's actually the issue even faced these days by the government itself.
Okay, thank you very much. In your paper and your co-authors, you analyzed 10 years of data on entrepreneurial firms in China. What were your findings on how corruption influences entrepreneurship?
This is actually another very good question. So what we really found here is that if we look at a small or young firm operating in a more corrupted provinces, more corrupted regions, and their performance in terms of productivity, in terms of profitability, in terms of valuation, going to be worse than similar young or small firms, but operating in less corrupted regions. And we see that same message if you look at firms operating in more corrupted industries, and they are actually suffer more compared to similar small and young firms operating in less corrupted industries.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Any pattern within region where the less urban areas more corrupt or larger urban areas more corrupt? Any specific findings there?
At this point, we basically try to hold everything constant, right? And so we try to make sure that these entrepreneur firms are comparable, right? And comparable in the sense that when you look at the regions with different degrees of corruption, you try to factor into the fact that there are other elements along the same region or along the same industry that may be different. So you, in the empirical analysis, you really have to make sure you control that different aspect. So you really pin down the corruption element rather than other factors that drive this differential performance.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks.
Yeah.
Clearly, corruption is something that exists in every country. What is it about China that makes it such an ideal location to study the relationship between corruption and business? How do you think the anti-corruption movement in China will impact things?
Well, you keep getting through the good questions. Well, these are also big questions. Actually, to begin with, everybody can talk about corruption, but what exactly is corruption is very hard to define, right? And even you look at Wikipedia these days, there are different entries and people put different explanations. And you see the same thing in academic research. And first of all, we don't observe actual corruption activities, right? And you may observe some indirect in terms of like a survey evidence and in terms of experimental sightings. So as a result, even you look at an academic researcher, and they actually give you very mixed evidence, right? Is corruption good or bad for the firm? Is corruption good or bad for the country, right? So what we really interesting in our setting is, of course, if you look at China's ranking, they always considered, no matter different sources, always consider China ranked very high in terms of level of corruption. But more importantly, what we have here is that we actually get hold of this very large data, and that actually give you a specific accounting account that actually is a good proxy measure the spending effort on corruption. And so that's actually this is not 100% great accuracy, but in terms of proxy, but you are one step closer to measure corruption more accurately than what we have, currently in academic research. So that's actually one good thing about this data. Another good thing about the data is that we have almost 86% of our sample, you talk about over 3 million observations, almost 86% of sample are private firms. And this is particularly important, especially for less developed countries, because we know, unlike United States, we have majority of, the economic activities are propelled by large publicly traded companies, but in emerging market, majority of economic activities are done by, private firms, especially young and small firms, and therefore it's very important to understand what they do in these countries and what kind of policies we can develop to actually foster their performance. Yeah, and in terms of the anti-corruption movement, actually, it's a very good question because this is actually the central question, not only as of concern of the Chinese government, but I'm sure it's a concern of every government. And there are actually many ways people come up with, how do we fight against corruption, right? You can impose laws, you can impose regulations, you can impose policies, or like in China, let's impose movement, right? And so it's actually a very good question, which mechanism is more effective in terms of fighting corruption, right? So there are actually some other researchers have done some work to evaluate how effective this movement it is. And at this point, there's some evidence showing that this movement, at least to some extent, seem to reduce the corruption in a certain degree.
Great, thank you. So 10 years of data. Any other surprises that you uncovered at this point?
It's actually, I would say surprising, but not surprising in the sense that we know how bad corruption affects small and young firms in the sense that they affect their performance through very interesting channels. First of all, because those resources are diverted to firms that are spending more on corruption, and as a result, it creates negative externalities for small young firms in terms of they're not getting these good demands, right? And also they don't get good financing. The young firms, small firms, in first place, they're going to have a very high difficulty level to get external financing. But when you're in the more corrupted area, you even face a higher barrier to get cheap financing. And that deters their growth. And more importantly, there's a misallocation of resources. You think about it, if you're more productive firms, you should get more labor or capital allocation from the industry. And we found actually corruption distort this allocation. And that may be the reason these young and small firms are facing high growth barriers in performance. And an interesting perspective is that first of all, there's a deter for entry. So as a result of this high corruption in these regions or industries, you see that young firms are less likely to enter in this area. And once they enter, you see what happens is that they begin to spend more on corruption as well.
Okay.
And so that's actually is sort of a, I would not say very surprising, but very worrisome findings we have.
Okay, thank you. So for small and young firms hoping to get a start in countries where corruption is a daily reality, is there anything they can do?
Okay. Well, this is a personal view. I think majority of this effort should be done through government or regulation or different sort of policies. They're less likely, especially the small young firms, they're less likely they can really do something that dramatically change the corruption environment. I think that's more rely on the lawmakers and the governments in terms of come up with more efficient policies or regulations or mechanisms and to actually fight the corruption from top. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for coming in and speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, @indiana.edu.